Thanks for coming to Humanities Day. It means a lot to the Humanities Division at the University of Chicago to have so many people attending. I'm really excited to talk about something I like a lot, which is ancient pottery. The goal for me today is just to describe to you why pottery is such an important part of archaeological analysis, which is really why I call this Why Archaeologists Love Pottery. That's a bit of a misleading title, honestly. There's some archaeologists who just loathe pottery. But they have to deal with it, and you'll see why they have to deal with it shortly. This, by the way, is an assemblage of pots that were excavated by my colleague, Professor David Schlone, from the site that he works at in southern Turkey called Zincirlikuyu. These all date to a destruction that we think was caused by a famous Hittite king named Hattusili I in about 1600 BC or so. So yeah, really this should be titled Why Archaeologists Use Pottery So Much and Why They Rely on Pottery So Much. That would be the more accurate description here. After I talk for, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes or so, probably more like half an hour, then I'm going to step down from the podium and just show you some genuine ancient artifacts, some potsherds that date to about 7,000 BC, all the way to some medieval potsherds that date to 1400 AD. So there's going to be a wide range, and then, yeah, that'll be a fun sort of show and tell at the end of it. I think maybe the first point to mention is just when pottery was invented and why it was invented. I teach a whole class here at the university called Ceramic Analysis and Archaeology, and I spend a full week on the origins of ceramics. So just very, very briefly here, pottery was originally thought to be involved with what archaeologists refer to as the Neolithic Revolution, which refers to the time period in humankind's history when we transitioned from being hunters and gatherers to people who live in the same place and support ourselves in terms of our subsistence through farming, through domesticated plants and animals. And when that happened, which was about, in different parts of the world, in the Middle East, where it seems to have happened first, about 8,000 BCE or so, there's a whole number of changes that came along with that. First and foremost, domesticated plants and animals meant that people were living in the same place year-round. Right? That's called sedentism. They weren't roaming the landscape as they tried to acquire subsistence. Once they were using agriculture to produce their food instead of hunting animals and collecting wild plants, then they had a lot more produce that they could deal with. In fact, even more produce than they were able to consume in a given year. That meant that they had to store some of that produce for longer periods of time, and according to archaeologists like V. Gordon Childe, who is probably the most important early 20th century archaeologist, that's why pottery was invented. You would have to put that extra grain somewhere that you weren't going to eat, that you were instead going to store over the winter or maybe trade with someone else in a nearby town, and you needed some kind of container, and so they came up with pottery to do that. And he coined this phrase, ex orient lux, from the east light, because it was all supposed to have appeared in the ancient Middle East and then spread from there. We now know this model is completely wrong, actually. In the past, I don't know, 15, 20 years or so, it's become clear that pottery was not invented at the time of the Neolithic Revolution. In fact, pottery was invented much, much earlier than that, like even before the end of the last ice age, which is about 12,000 years ago or so. It seems now that pottery was invented more or less simultaneously in Japan, in East Asia, and Far East Russia around 17,000, 16,000 years ago. That's really incredible. What does that mean in terms of the social organization of the people making that pottery? It means that they were not themselves farmers. They were hunters and gatherers. That's highly counterintuitive, right? Pottery is big, it's bulky, it's heavy. It's not something you associate with people who are on the move for most of their year. But in fact, that does seem to be the case. Now, it's not the case that once pottery was invented, it was immediately accepted as a day-to-day part of people's lives. So we have several thousand years where pottery technology, the knowledge of pottery technology was present, but pottery itself wasn't widely in use, wasn't widely accepted. That took another several thousand years to begin. The first site that really blew up this Neolithic model for the invention of pottery is this unassuming place called Oda Yamamoto. This is a hunter-gatherer camp in Japan. And from this site, this rather unaesthetically pleasing archaeological site, were found 46 potsherds that, as I say, date to 16,000 years ago. So that's what we think now is basically the oldest pottery that we've got in the world. We call this incipient Jomon pottery. Jomon pottery is the earliest type of pottery that was invented in Japan. Then they found stuff earlier than that. They had to call that pre-Jomon. Then they found Oda Yamamoto. What are you going to call it? Incipient Jomon, they decided to call it. And now there's something of an arms race between archaeologists in East China, East Russia, and Japan who can find the earliest potsherd. Right now, this is probably about as early as it gets. So, to answer the question then, why do archaeologists study pottery so much? Well, once pottery does become a major part of people's material lives, which is more or less around the time of the Neolithic period, then it's so common on archaeological sites that you can't help but deal with it. It is by far the most common type of artifact that archaeologists encounter, bar none. There are, in any given archaeological site from the Neolithic period until contemporary periods, potentially millions of potsherds inside that site. So it gives you the potential for a lot of information. And what I tell students in my ceramic analysis class is even if you yourself aren't going to be a ceramicist, someone whose research interest is itself pottery, you're going to need to know a lot about pottery to do whatever it is you want to do, because pottery gives us three major sources of information that even if you're studying economics and trade or ancient diet, you're going to need to know about. And that's pottery that gives you that information. The first one is dating evidence. We use pottery styles and the way pottery changes over time as one of our major chronological tools in dating archaeological assemblages. People often ask me all the time, how do you know the site you're excavating dates to 2000 BC? Usually the answer is because of the pottery styles that we're excavating from that site that I know already date to that time period. Distributional evidence. Potsherds tell us about the motion of people and about the motion of the pots, and that's a major research question for any ancient historian. Where do people come from? Where do the things that they are using come from? We can learn about that from pottery. And then finally, pottery itself can tell us a lot about ancient culture, right? Their dietary patterns, their feasting patterns, their social structure, their social organization. Or if we were to summarize this even further, when, where, and for what. Let's just go through these one by one in a little bit more detail. There is, of course, laboratory or scientific techniques for dating archaeological sites. We call those absolute dating. That's things like radiocarbon analysis, which was invented here at the University of Chicago, by the way. Dendrochronology, all these sort of laboratory techniques for dating archaeological sites. Fine. There is also a whole other approach to dating archaeological sites that we call relative dating, and that's where pottery really is such a powerful tool. This gives you a good example of it. Flinders Petrie was an English archaeologist who worked in many places across the Middle East, including the southern Levant, or today's Israel and Palestine, and especially in Egypt. And he excavated a prehistoric cemetery in Egypt called Nakada. And we're seeing several assemblages from tombs that he excavated from that cemetery. Each one of these horizontal rows represents the assemblage of pottery that he found interred with a specific individual in a given tomb. So there's, 7 tombs worth of pottery assemblages that we're looking at here. He realized, given the hundreds of tombs that were there, they can't all have been dug on the same day or even in the same year. They must have a chronological span. But he didn't know which one came first. So he started arranging the assemblages of pots from these graves on top of one another, like in this chart, and realized some of them are completely unrelated to one another ceramically, and others are very closely related to one another ceramically. And then he had this sort of light bulb moment where he realized the grave assemblages where the pots resemble one another must be close in date to one another, and the grave assemblages where the ceramics don't resemble one another at all must be far apart ceramically. So for example, this one on the top here must be a pretty different chronological date than the one on the bottom. But the two on the top must be pretty close in time because they share 3 or 4 of the vessel types. And then he realized he could stack them all according to like with like and come up with a pretty decent sequence. This is what he called seriation. In class, if I were with students right now in my basement classroom, and it wasn't such a large group as this, I would ask the students, what's the major problem with this? And eventually someone realizes that you can't necessarily tell just from this seriation that he did, which is the first one and which is the last one. You can tell the sequence, but you can't tell which came first. Maybe that one on the bottom is the earliest, maybe that one on the top is the earliest. That's why things like absolute dating, the C14 analysis can be so helpful. Nevertheless, without this ceramics, you wouldn't have this really good seriation to tell you how to order your assemblages. Once you know what time period certain pots date to, you can then use them to date every single thing that you find on an archaeological survey or in archaeological excavation. We excavate a site, we find a certain style of pottery, bang, we know we're dealing with the early Middle Bronze Age. Or we find red slip burnished ware, that must mean we're dealing with 9th to 8th century BCE. Another question I'm often asked is, how do you know where all the archaeological sites are? Well, people don't realize this, but they're often covered with literally thousands of artifacts. So you just walk across the ground, and when you see thousands of pieces of broken pottery under your foot, you know you're standing on top of an archaeological site. Why is that the case? Because pottery is like ancient Pyrex or Tupperware. It just doesn't go away. It doesn't biodegrade. It is fragile, like it will break. A pot will break into dozens of sherds, but those sherds aren't going anywhere. So this is the surface of a tell or ancient settlement mound in what's today Kurdistan, northeastern Iraq. And all of those things you're looking at, well, not quite all. I do see some rocks in that photograph. 95% of what you're looking at there is just broken pieces of pottery that's just sitting there on the surface of the site. And then those two archaeologists walking up the slope of it, what they're doing is scouring the surface of the site for what we call diagnostic potsherds. Actually, the first thing I should say is that when you're speaking in archaeological terms, never say shard. Only say sherd. It's a major shibboleth. If you say shard, I know you're not an archaeologist. Why do archaeologists say sherds instead of shards? I have no idea. But that's just the way it is. Shards of glass, sherds of pottery. These archaeologists are scouring the surface for diagnostic potsherds. What's a diagnostic potsherd? That's one that gives us chronological information. So as you can imagine, not all sherds are made equal. A body sherd, a part that's just from the side of a vessel, that could probably come from any vessel from any time period. But the rim sherd, the base, the handle, something with painted or incised decoration, that's chronologically significant. That's the kind of thing that changes over time. So we collect those sherds, take them back to the survey house at night, and then we can map the site according to different time periods. This sort of oval feature in the middle here, that's the mound that, on the slopes of which I'm taking this photograph in this slide. That mound has built up over thousands of years of successive settlements being built on top of one another. But the site in certain time periods spread off the mound when it expanded, and sometimes hundreds of meters off of that main mound. All of these polygons that you're looking at here are just arbitrary collection units that we made as surveyors. That's just where a certain archaeologist went to walk around with a plastic bag and put those diagnostic potsherds in that he or she found underfoot. If they're blue, they didn't find any from a certain time period. If they're red, there's lots of diagnostic sherds from that time period. So now you can see in the top left, period 4, that's like 5th millennium, period 6, 4th millennium. There's some occupation on the main mound and basically no occupation off mound. And then in the mid to late 3rd millennium, the site explodes in size. Now this whole entire outer town is occupied. Then it shrinks again in the Middle Bronze Age, only to expand again in the Late Bronze Age, only to shrink again in the Iron Age, only to expand again in the Parthian period. You can see the site fluctuating in size like an accordion through time, thanks to the potsherds that we picked up from these survey units that the archaeologists collected. So just from literally 1 day's of work walking across this site, archaeologists have a pretty decent understanding of this city's settlement history through time. It's pretty amazing, pretty powerful stuff that pottery has given us here. The next issue I want to talk about is the distributional nature of ceramics. Archaeologists are able to distinguish pottery styles' regional distribution in space. So when we're talking about time, we're thinking about like a vertical diachronic ceramic spread. Here, we're interested in horizontally. What does it mean to have a certain style of pottery spread across space, all at more or less the same time? It can mean a couple of different things. One thing that it really indexes very strongly in many cases is evidence for the movement of peoples, right? This is evidence for migration. And this migration is one of the more famous versions from ancient Middle Eastern cultures. This happened around 3000 BCE or so, where a certain culture who made this really beautiful, really lustrous red-black burnished ware that you can see in the top right there, and I have a couple sherds of it I'll show you at the end, started moving for reasons that remain unclear, all the way across what archaeologists, I didn't want to change that yet. I'm trying to, I can't bring up oh, you can see my cursor, oh good. All across what archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, right? This crescent of settlement across most of the Middle East. We didn't even recognize this as an ancient migration for decades because this is a pottery style that appeared in many different modern countries. So we had archaeologists working in Iran call this kiraz ware. We had archaeologists working in Iraq call it kirbit karik ware after the first site that they excavated it there. Archaeologists in southern Turkey calling it red-black burnished ware. And eventually someone realized, hang on a second, all of these terms are describing the same ceramic tradition just found all over the ancient Middle East. That's probably because the same group of people were using them. And indeed, it now seems that for whatever reason, around 3000 BC, a group of people that lived up here in the Caucasus migrated over the course of centuries down the eastern Mediterranean coast and down the slopes of the Zagros Mountains. We wouldn't have known that if it weren't for pottery. But probably you can already tell that this isn't always a strong line of argumentation for migration. Why? Because pots move for many reasons. People just trade pots sometimes. So it's often a subject of fierce archaeological debate. Are we finding this spread of pots because people are moving or just because the pots are moving? It's not always clear. In this particular case, there's so many different archaeological correlates besides pottery that suggest this, that it seems pretty confident. But I'd like to give you an example here also of pots that are moving that aren't necessarily being accompanied by some kind of migration. This site here, ancient Kunalua, which is the modern site of Tel Tayanat, was excavated by ISAC, by the University of Chicago, in this museum in the 1930s. If you ever go through the galleries here around the corner and you come to the Anatolian Gallery, you'll find monumental remains, statuary, inscriptions that were excavated in the 1930s by my predecessors here as faculty on display right there in the halls. This is what the site looks like today. Here's another one of these mounds built up over time by successive settlement being stacked on top of one another. Just out of interest's sake, maybe you can see a slight discoloration in the fields surrounding it. Over here, this is the lower town that today is buried under the modern surface of the valley because alluviation from the nearby river has deposited about 1 millimeter of sediment on top of the fields every year. So they're about 3 meters down. Underneath here, you get to other Iron Age settlement parts of the city. The University of Chicago archaeologists in the 1930s didn't just excavate Tayanat, they also did a survey of all the sites that were in the region and thought, in a really advanced sort of scientific model for 1930s scholars, thought, you know what, we shouldn't just excavate the biggest Iron Age city, we should also excavate a medium-sized city and a tiny little Iron Age village. And then we can compare what life was like in these 3 different parts of the settlement hierarchy. We have remains from all 3 of these sites in our museum here, And when I was writing my dissertation, I was a student at another university, but coincidentally writing my dissertation on University of Chicago material, not knowing that later I would become a faculty member here. I spent months and months in the basement analyzing Iron Age potsherds from all 3 of these sites. And I was really interested in one type in particular because it's not local to the valley that these sites are located in. This is a Cypriot style of pottery that is present in all 3 of the ceramic collections from these sites. And I wondered, gosh, are all of these Cypriot? I wonder if all of these actually came from Cyprus and were traded and made it across the Mediterranean Sea to the eastern coast of Turkey. Or maybe some of them were made as local imitations. This is a very common research question for archaeologists studying pottery. Is this actually elite, fancy, imported stuff, or is it just local people making it look like they've got some fancy, elite, imported stuff, like fake Gucci bags? I took, with the museum's permission, you can understand, I'm sure, that the museum doesn't necessarily like artifacts to be broken and crushed down into powders and sent to laboratories for analysis. So eventually, they did very kindly allow me to snap off about a square centimeter from 128 sherds, which indeed got ground into powder and sent for neutron activation analysis, which is a technique that allows you to compare the chemical makeup or elements that are present in the clays, and you can tell which clays are local and which clays are present, and therefore which sherds are imports and which are locally produced. As you can see, all of the so-called Cypriot sherds from my medium site of Çatalhöyük and my tiny village of Judea and my capital city of Tianat have sherds that belong to this alpha group, but only Tianat has elements in its clay that belong to this beta group, which was interesting because I used this crummy local pottery as a way of comparing the 2 groups. And here, what do you see? But a lot of sherds that belong to the beta group. In fact, only the beta group. In other words, we have 2 kinds of clays that were used to make this Cypriot style pottery. One that is alpha, but also at the capital city, a subset that is clearly made out of local clays. It's the same style, the same kind of clay that the local pottery was made out of. And indeed, if I compare the actual clay sources, which is what these triangles and squares represent, actual clay sources that scholars have analyzed with the same techniques, you can see that beta refers to local clays, alpha refers to Cypriot clays. Really, really interesting. That surprised me a lot. I would have thought at the capital city, you had the genuine imported fancy stuff from Cyprus, and at the tiny villages where the people couldn't afford that and made local imitations. Instead, everyone apparently could afford the elite Cypriot-style pottery, and in the capital city is where they also had this subset of the fake Gucci bags. That's kind of neat. That's interesting stuff. That's the kind of thing that archaeologists like to do with pottery. And then finally pottery itself can tell you about social organization, status, that kind of thing. It stands to reason that, for example, wealthier people are going to have nicer pots. You can use the pottery style of distribution across your excavated areas and say, okay, well maybe field 1 is a wealthier place for people to have lived than field 2 where I'm excavating because the pottery there is nicer, just to give you a very straightforward example. Here's another example that I find very interesting. In a lot of ancient contexts, the actually wealthy people didn't use pottery, they used metal vessels. And if you were using pottery, it's because you couldn't afford the metal stuff. And instead, you might use what we call a skeuomorph, which is just a fancy word for imitation. So here's a skeuomorph on the right of a vessel on the left that's the actually expensive one made out of metal. That's indicative of things like social organization. Here's another vessel I was looking at in the course of doing my dissertation down in the bowels of the basement of this museum many years ago. Just so that you understand what we're looking at here, this is a common form of illustration for archaeologists for the purpose of illustrating ceramics. On the left is the exterior of the vessel. On the right is the profile of the vessel with the interior surface shown. The fact that it's grayed like that means it has some kind of burnishing, which I'll show you in person in a minute as well. Now I thought, this is surely significant. This is a fancier bowl than any of the other things I've been looking at all of these weeks while I've been in this room looking at the stuff. None of them had this kind of sort of bumpy undersurface that's so aesthetically pleasing. I wonder what it was used for. Unfortunately, the archaeologist notes from the 1930s weren't very good. I wasn't sure where they found it. I thought maybe I'm at a loss here. All I can say is that this one's nicer than most of the stuff. But there are artistic depictions of this vessel. This is the Neo-Assyrian Empire's king, Ashurbanipal, lounging on a garden sofa with his wife, Ashusharat, who's holding in her right hand this very vessel. Now, she's probably holding the metal example that I was just describing to you, right? Because she's the queen. But this is the same kind of thing. And I think, oh, okay, well, this, by the way, dates to about 700 BCE, more or less, maybe mid-7th century. Not too far off in date from the Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs that are on display just around the corner if you're interested. Here's another example of a similar artifact, this time from a site that's just 50 kilometers away from Tainat. And here, this guy who seems to be holding it in the crux of it, like he's going, hey, like that. He's got the exact same vessel in his hand that Queen Ashusharat had in hers. And this time, it's accompanied by an inscription. Now, that's really helpful. This text tells us that the person being depicted here is a man named Katamua, and the inscription is saying, please, descendants of mine, please continue offering my spirit the foods that are presented on this table so that I may continue, so that my soul may continue dining in peace in the afterlife. That suggests to me that all of the artifacts that are on this Katamua stele, including this bowl that I was holding in my hands downstairs in the basement, are related to funerary feasting events. And that all of a sudden I realized that the bowl I was holding was probably used in some kind of funerary feast, which was pretty exciting. Now you might be thinking, but that's weird because it doesn't look like the Assyrian king and his wife are at a funerary feasting event. And this looks like a very nice bucolic garden scene. Oh, there, I'm just illustrating what I see. But if we zoom out a little bit, this is one of my favorite things to show students. I show it all the time in as many classes as I can. Take a moment to see what else is being depicted in this apparently tranquil and peaceful garden scene. You might not be able to make it out if you don't know what you're looking for. But up in the top left, I don't want to change slides, up in the top left, right above my cursor right there, is the severed head of one of Ashurbanipal's defeated enemies that he is hanging in the tree of his garden and enjoying his luxurious banquet with this head in the trees. So we can interpret this scene as actually being a sort of ironic funerary feast in its own way. He is, in fact, actually conducting a funerary feast with his wife, in this case, commemorating his defeat over his vanquished enemy. So, yeah, Near Assyrian art can be pretty gruesome at times. Likewise, just as a final example, we can use pottery to tell us just a simple basic question like, what were people eating? This is a photograph from the oldest intact wooden structure that is still existent today. It dates to about 740 BCE. We took students in the study abroad program in April to go see it. This is the tomb that we thought might belong to King Midas, he of the famous Golden Touch, the king of Phrygia. In fact, it's probably a little bit earlier than he would have been alive. Maybe this is his father. But inside of this tomb, this wooden structure, which is buried inside of a gigantic tumulus, were several dozens of ceramic vessels that we could perform residue analysis on, in which the scientist is able to extract lipids and residues from the ancient contents of the vessel, which is pretty amazing. You need really good preservation for that. But if you do have good preservation, then you can do things like reconstruct ancient recipes. And this is a real marketed beer called the Midas Touch that I think Dogfish had. Now I'm forgetting the brewery that made this. I think it was dogfish head, that they produced that you could buy that was using the ingredients that the scientists were able to reconstruct came from the vessels that were found in the tomb of Midas's possible father, which is pretty neat. So normally we can't do quite this, but we can understand ancient ways of dietary patterns, which is pretty exciting. Okay, I think that is probably a perfect place to stop. What I wanted to do next was just, as I say, have a little bit of a show and tell here with the pots that are on display. I'll just walk you through a couple of them. It's a real treat to be able to be an archaeology faculty member here at the ISAC Museum specifically, where there's hundreds of thousands. Helen is our registrar, and she can tell me there's something like 350,000 artifacts in the basement. Is that right?
Certainly 300,000, yeah.
300,000, and to be able to, with Helen's help, take them out and show them to students in the ceramic analysis class that I teach, for example. Every class, I'll lecture on a certain theme, and then at the end of class, we'll literally just look at the actual ancient artifacts themselves, which you can't do at most places. It's a real benefit for me as a faculty member and for the students who are here. In that class, I'm lucky enough that the students, it's a small enough group, and the stuff is usually broken pieces of pottery, and with the museum's permission, we're able to, all of us, pass these trays around, pick them up, look at them, get a good look at them. And so the students are literally able to handle artifacts that are thousands of years old, which I certainly couldn't do as an undergraduate student. Today, unfortunately, I'm not going to allow you guys to touch them because there's too many of you and you haven't been vetted by the relevant authorities. But afterwards, when I'm done talking, I think it's okay if you want to just come up and have a better look at them. I think just make sure you're standing a couple of feet back. We don't want anyone falling into this table, but you're very welcome to come up and have a better look at them. So I think maybe the first point to mention is that the stuff that you see on this side of the table, which is intact and whole and complete, is relatively rare. These probably come from things like tomb contexts, right? Contexts where the ceramics are deliberately left to be undisturbed. Most of the time when you're just excavating a site, you're finding broken pieces of pottery like this. And this is what you spend 95% of your day dealing with, this broken pieces of pottery and trying to reconstruct them, what they would have looked like, what the whole vessel may have looked like. So this stuff is rare. This stuff is very, very common. What to start with? There's so many good choices. Well, one thing that I find very interesting to tell students about is that when pottery does emerge in the ancient Middle East, it is surprisingly incredibly ornate in terms of its decoration. I think you can probably make out here pretty elaborate painted decorations on these sherds. These sherds probably date to about 7,000, 6,000 BC or so, the 7th millennium BC, let's say. This is some of the earliest pottery from the ancient Middle East. It's called Halafian ceramics. So this is pre-state. These are people who are living in a level of social complexity that's just beginning to become unevenly distributed. There's just beginning to be people with power over people who don't have power, people with a little bit more wealth and people who are a little bit less wealthy. It's not like there's a king and a palace and a temple. And yet at that time is when we find some of the ancient Middle East's most intricately decorated sherds. To contrast that is this crummy vessel that comes from the late 4th millennium BC, by which time southern Mesopotamia is indeed at a state level of organization. We have really complicated social organizations, monumental buildings, elaborate religion, very much socially stratified. And at that time is when the pottery is incredibly mundane and incredibly uninteresting. This is called the beveled rim bowl, or what Mesopotamian archaeologists affectionately refer to as the BRB, named after this bevel to its rim. And it's one of Mesopotamia's most famous pot forms because it's found not just in southern Mesopotamia, where it originated at the site of Uruk, but all the way up into eastern Turkey, because traders from southern Mesopotamia, as early as 3300 BCE or so, are sending colonies all the way out into the mountains of eastern Turkey to extract its resources, its minerals, its metals, in order to fund the palaces and the temples that they were developing with the social stratification in the first state-level society in southern Mesopotamia. So you start seeing this at sites all across the ancient Middle East, and it's a real indicator or marker of this diaspora of southern Mesopotamian traders, which is pretty wild. This is a prehistoric vessel from Egypt. I mostly wanted to show it because it's straight out of the seriation of Sir Flinders Petrie, right? This is a vessel that was illustrated on that slide. This comes from the Nicotis cemetery that Flinders Petrie was excavating and analyzing when he was doing his seriation. And you can see in this case, the circles are in fact a spiral that the potter is by hand tracing out. I can tell it's done without any implementation other than the paintbrush because the spirals are so uneven. By a few thousand years later, they would use a compass, and they can just turn the compass, and that makes perfect concentric circles. When you come up close and peer forward to get a better look, you can take a look at this goblet, which comes from southwestern Iran. This is also, I think, 3rd millennium BC, although, Helen, you can correct me if that's wrong. Even earlier than that, 4th millennium. Chalcolithic, southwestern Iran. What I like about this vessel, there's a couple things. In terms of its decoration, these pale rectangles are outlined in negatives. So you can see if you look closely, they've drawn the square and then they've colored in everything in behind it to leave the pale parts unpainted and negative. I like that. You can really see that that's how they did it when you look closely. The other thing I like about this is its pointed base. What does that tell you in terms of how this would have been used when it's filled with liquid? Well, you can't put it down when it's still got liquid in it. You've got to finish it. You've got to chug what you're drinking, and only then can you put your drink down. And archaeologists frequently, and I think in most cases probably rightly, consider this a marker of a vessel that would have been used in some kind of like a ritual or semi-ritual feasting event. Like, it's very common anthropologically around the world for intoxicants to be drunk in this kind of way, where you have to finish what you're drinking before you're done with it, so that you are able to, perform the rituals to its greatest extent. This vessel, which is an Iron Age one, I wanted to show mainly so that you could see very clearly that, like many ancient pottery vessels, this has been slipped and burnished. Slip is a liquid clay, almost like a thinner than paint, but you could consider it like a paint substance that the potter dunks the pot in, and it coats it with this thin layer of clay-colored coating. That's done partially to decrease its porosity, but also to make it look more like a metal piece. This is what makes it shiny and red and makes it look like a more effective skewer morph. And then you can see streaks where the potter has taken some kind of implement and scrubbed it to make it even shinier. And you can see the streaks of the burnishing on there as you look at it. What else do I want to show you? The pottery doesn't always look the way that the potter intended it to. You might find a sherd that looks like this. It's cracked, like these ancient cracks here. I'm not referring to the brokenness of the sherd itself, but even the part of the sherd that's intact has crack marks all the way through it. It's this sort of sickly green color. It's completely wobbly and wonky in shape. This is a misfiring. This is the pot that was made by the potter. They made mistakes too. And this is what we call a waster, something that they wouldn't have actually used. They would have thrown it away and discarded it. Here's another waster. As you can tell, the rim is completely wonky. This is not what the potter intended it to look like. But of course, it also doesn't biodegrade. It's also indestructible, and so we have it preserved for us as well. These ones are some of my favorite ancient Bronze Age pots. I don't know why they're called this, but they're called bilbils, B-I-L-B-I-L. And they come from Cyprus, and they're found in the late Bronze Age, let's say 1600 to 1200 BCE. They're found all the way from Middle Egypt up into the central Anatolian plateau. It was thought for a long time, actually this is a better shaped example of it to show you. It was thought for a long time that these were used to distribute drugs, opiates in particular, not in some kind of like contemporary drug cartel way, but presumably for rituals, for special events that would have been socially sanctioned, is what I'm trying to say. Not illicit, but socially sanctioned opiates. Why? Because it looked to the archaeologists like the opium plant. And that was literally the grounds on which that interpretation was based on. In just recent years, archaeologists have done residue analysis on the contents of a broken bilbil and found that they didn't contain opiates at all. They contained oils. They were probably for perfumes and unguents and things like that, oils and perfumes. So that's a little disappointing. I used to like telling my students that this was ancient heroin, but unfortunately, it's not the case. Maybe the last, there's two more things I'll show you, and then I'll stop. I just want to show this cooking pot. This would be ripe for residue analysis. The inside of this would probably have lots of residues preserved inside of the clay that the analyst could discover. I also am pretty certain that this cooking pot was actually used. Why? Because it has what we call fire clouding, where the exterior of the vessel has been discolored differentially around it because of its being placed in the fire. So originally, when it came out of the kiln, the entire vessel would have looked this color here, the top of the handles, the one part that doesn't get put in the fire. But eventually, it all turns dark gray and black as it's baked. And then finally, the last thing that you can see when you come over here, if this is our earliest pottery on the table, 7000 BC, here's the pottery from the medieval period. As you can see now, they've invented the technology of glazing, which is sort of using liquid glass to create really brightly, beautifully, ornately decorated ceramic patterns. So as soon as as an archaeologist who specializes in the Bronze and Iron Age, long before glazing was invented, find sherds like this on a site, I know I'm not interested in it anymore because I can tell right away this stuff is only 700 years old instead of 5,000 years old. But it is really beautiful stuff. I think that's probably all I'm going to say. Before I stop talking, and why don't I invite questions first, and then I'll invite anyone who's interested to come have a quick look at this in person. So thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to take questions if there are any in the audience here. Yes, sir.
When you showed the mounds with and you were talking about the sherds from different periods.
Yeah.
That surprised me because I wouldn't expect sherds from the earliest periods that are farthest down to have worked their way to the top.
That's a really good question. Let's go back and look at that distribution because I wanted to talk about that and then I figured I'd just move on. Went too far. If you look at the earliest period in the top left there, that number 1 that you see in those 3 green polygons, that means we literally only found 1 sherd from that time period in that polygon. Unlike 11 and 8 and whatever that are found in some of the richer red polygons. That is because the earliest period is the lowest one down, and therefore there's only a handful of that earliest period actually preserved on the surface. So it is as you would expect that there's fewer from the earlier periods on the top of the mound. Why is there any from the earliest periods on the top of the mound? You'd be surprised. Rain washes certain gullies away and a bit bleeds out from the side maybe. Or a rodent that is building a warren through the base of the mound, takes a piece of pottery, then kicks it out of the way as it's scurrying to continue its burrow, and that pottery eventually makes its way to the surface. The potsherds that are inside of a site are a lot more mobile than archaeologists first thought. It turns out they're always churning a little bit. So it is a little bit as you would expect, but you still do find the earliest stuff even right on the surface.
Going off that question, why do I'm not an archaeologist, so I'm going to say shards. Why
I already told you not to say shards.
why do any shards at all rise to the top of the mountain? Because I'm assuming if we go back to the previous slide with Tel Barkat or whatever,
Yeah.
I'm assuming there's a settlement below that mound.
Yep.
So, and I'm seeing like a lot of shards. I'm just curious, how do all of those emerge to the surface?
So if you were to put a pick and shovel into the soil there, it would be maybe 20 centimeters of topsoil, and then right away under that surface is going to be mud brick architecture and ancient settlement. So it's not deep. It's right under the surface. So it's just, I don't know, but part of the way the earth is there. By earth I mean the soil. Like it's just full of pottery. It's just full of it. So if it only 20 centimeters down, it doesn't take much rain for more sherds to be brought up to the surface. And every winter there's a big rain season and more sherds come up. It's just, the way these ancient settlements look like today on the surface. I was just about to say something else as well about that. I'm forgetting. But yes, the pottery is so shallow, it's just so immediately under the surface that it really doesn't take much for sherds to be exposed. Yeah. Go ahead.
My question is about identifying the funerary vessel, and given that drawings or like sculptures are at that time are not photographic, how can you have confidence in saying what's depicted here is actually that specific vessel that I found.
I mean, it just looked a lot like it. Yes, it's not photographic. It doesn't look 100% like it, but it sure looks enough like it that I feel like it's a reasonable claim to make. In the end, it's an argument that I have to make, that I have to justify, but it's not implausible. Let's put it that way. That's about as far as I can go with it. I know there are questions online as well that I'd like our online viewers to be able to ask. Are there any? Yeah, okay, good. And then I'll come back to the audience here as well.
Yeah, so Lynn on the virtual end of things is wondering, regarding the movement of pottery, if contents of pottery reveal agricultural differences across the sites.
Yes, although when we excavate ancient pots, most of the time we don't know what was in them. You have to do this residue analysis to really understand what was inside of them. You can learn a little bit about the contents of vessels from their shape. So for example, this little tiny bilbil pot that I showed you here, this isn't going to be very effective at holding grain. It's small and it has a tiny little hole in it. There is a morphological constraint there. It had to have been something liquid. On the other hand, a gigantic pithos is really good for storing grain. So if you find differences in distribution that way, then yes, you can use the shapes of the vessels to understand how they're being used in different places. But for the most part, to really know how a vessel was used, you have to send a sample of it to a laboratory to tell you. I did see another hand up here. Yes, go ahead.
I was wondering, there's been so much about countries reclaiming artifacts and art, and the collection here is so great. I wondered if any of these, like Kurdistan and Iraq and other places, would like to reclaim some of these
So
artifacts.
for people online, the question was, is the museum involved in any repatriation claims from Middle Eastern countries? That is something that's happening with museums all around the world. To my knowledge, it hasn't yet happened to the ISAC Museum. And I think that's because everything that's in our display collections here was taken from those countries under legal agreements with those countries at the time. Like in the 1930s, the stuff from Taltayinat that are on display here was taken with a legal partage agreement that was made with the Turkish government in the 1930s. It's not like the 1850s hyper-colonial acquisition movements at the Louvre and the British Museum and so on, just sort of plucked stuff up and took them back to Europe. Now, that's not to say that a country might today say, yeah, I know it was legal in 1930, but we'd still like that back, please, and thank you. And if you'd like to continue doing research here, then it might be in your interest to give it to us. But that hasn't happened yet. It probably will at some point, and we'll just have to play it by ear and hope we can negotiate in good faith with everybody to come to a positive outcome. Yes, go ahead.
I'm curious about the civilizations. So you see all these shards of artifacts here, but I don't see civilization anymore in this photo. So I'm wondering, why would those people all just move and just build something in the Istanbul area or the Athens area?
Yeah.
Why would they abandon this area? Does that tell you anything?
Yeah, and it's the only way to answer that is that there's no one answer. It's almost different on a site-by-site basis. So this site that you're looking at here is mounded because it has inside of that mound, like a layer cake, settlement stacked on top of settlement on top of settlement. And so at some point, someone decided to build a city here. 100, 200 years later, it was abandoned. Maybe the spring went dry or it was conquered by some invading army, but they decided to rebuild it. And that happened again and again and again until you've got a 30-meter tall mound. And then the last time, who knows, maybe at this time, they thought, oh, the well went dry and it didn't come back. And so they had to go somewhere else. I don't know, there's sites get abandoned for different reasons all over the place. And it's the kind of thing that when you can't really answer it in a single lifetime. Like we don't experience it ourselves. It's not like we're ever going to ourselves see Chicago be abandoned. But of course it will be at some point, right? And that will happen for its own unique reasons that will be different maybe from why Peoria or St. Louis get abandoned sometime down the road. But anyway, the usual factors are something like environmental change that force people to leave. Political instability, military conflicts. Yeah, I would say those three are probably the main reasons why sites get abandoned. Yeah. Sure, economic patterns change for whatever reason. And people have better opportunities elsewhere. Yeah. And then I'll go back to you, Annie.
I'm curious about distances. You talked about pottery styles from 3,000. Thinking about distances 3,000, 4,000, 7,000 years ago, do you have evidence of this, either the pottery or people moving far afield, India, China, Spain? You know, because you have the big focus on the Middle East and Egypt, and I didn't know if these pottery styles really remain confined to this area.
That's a good question. Around 5,000 BC, we can see pottery styles from Mesopotamia spreading along the western coast of the Persian Gulf. And we see certain ceramic kinds of artifacts, not pottery in this case, but cylinder seals, which is literally just a cylinder that is engraved with something like an iconographic scene that you can roll across the clay to mark it, like a King Henry VIII would stamp something with a seal. That would appear as far afield as the Harappan civilization of ancient India and Pakistan. Although that's not pottery per se. At least for the Bronze and Iron Age periods that I know, the pottery seems to be more or less geographically constrained to the ancient Middle East, Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Iraq, Egypt. And that's the sort of domain, the maximum distance threshold of ceramic circulation. Annie, did you have another question online? And then maybe it's time to wrap up after that.
Well, the last question in the chat is Lisa asking if you yourself are also a potter.
When I was doing my dissertation, I'm one of the kind of archaeologists that has to do ceramics to study other things. Like I wanted to study what the built environment and architecture and settlement patterns could tell us about political authority. In order to do that, I had to date the buildings and date the sites that I was finding on settlement patterns. In order to do that, I had to study pottery a little bit. And so I'm not someone who studies ceramics as a ceramicist. I study other things and need ceramics to do that. And that got my graduate student friends to call me a pot head instead of a ceramicist. I do take students in my ceramic analysis and archaeology class to the Hyde Park Art Center, where we spend a day throwing pottery mostly just to have some fun doing it and also to learn how hard it is. You think it's easy when you're looking at something like this. It's incredibly difficult to make pottery if you are not yourself an expert in it. So I'm reminded of that lesson every 2 years when I teach the class, that I'm not a potter, but it's a lot of fun. And there are classes taught at the Hyde Park Arts Center, as well as here in the Logan Center, I think, on campus, if people are interested in trying it out themselves. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. I want to remind you that at 3 o'clock, I think, there's more Humanities Day to be enjoyed at the Regenstein Library with Professor Eric Slaughter. Thanks very much for being here. I hope you have a good Humanities Day.